Lydia Mercer set the wine decanter down on the sideboard, turned around, and walked back into the dining room while 9 wealthy people were still laughing about her. She heard every word, the books, the library chair, the Latin. She kept her face completely empty and her spine completely straight, and she moved through that room like a woman who had not just heard herself discussed like a circus exhibit, like a woman who had heard nothing at all. Her hand shook once beneath the silver tray, just once. Nobody saw it, except the Duke. If you've ever been laughed at by someone who had no right to judge you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. She kept walking. That was the thing about Lydia Mercer that nobody at Blackthorn Hall had ever bothered to learn. She always kept walking. Through her father's death in a rented Boston room with $17 in a tin box, and no family left on either side of the Atlantic. Through 2 years of moving from house to house in England, with a letter of reference nobody could verify, and nobody bothered to. Through 3 years of Blackthorn's early mornings and late nights, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from the body, but from spending every waking hour making yourself smaller so that other people could feel larger. She kept walking, and she kept her face empty, and she set the decanter down on the side table without a sound. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The candles were burning. The silver was polished. 9 guests sat around Nathaniel Ashcombe's dining table, and Beatrice Whitlock was entertaining them. Beatrice was 46, widowed, and the kind of woman who had decided years ago that the chair at the Duke's right hand belonged to her, and had simply never moved from it. She had the laugh of a woman who had never once been laughed at in return, full, comfortable, landing just ahead of the actual punchline, so that everyone else scrambled to catch up. "You will not believe what I discovered this morning," Beatrice said. She touched her wine glass without lifting it, a small theatrical gesture. "I came down to the library before anyone else was stirring. And there she was, the maid, sitting in the Duke's reading chair with Tacitus open across her lap. The annals, no less. Someone said, 'You're joking.' I am absolutely not joking." She had a candle, a cup of cold tea, the most thoroughly absorbed expression you have ever seen on a woman who was supposed to be laying the morning fires. Lydia moved to the next glass. Her footsteps were silent on the carpet. She had learned to move through rooms the way water moves through cracks, finding the path of least resistance, taking up the least possible space. "Does she actually understand it?" a man asked. "Or is she just turning pages?" That, Beatrice said, "is exactly what I want to find out." The table leaned forward. People who are about to watch something they'd be embarrassed to admit enjoying always lean forward. "Invite her to dinner," Beatrice said, formally, at this table. "Thursday. If she insists on reading like a lady, surely she can survive eating like one." The laughter came fast and easy, the way laughter does when a room has already decided who it belongs to. Lydia was 6 feet away. She kept her eyes on the wine. She kept her breathing even. She kept the tray level in both hands, and she did not, under any circumstance, let a single muscle in her face move. Nathaniel Ashcombe was at the head of the table, 38 years old. The kind of face that had been handsome at 25, and had since settled into something more serious, more considered. He had been a widower for 8 years, and those 8 years had taught him that the most effective way to survive social obligations was to be in the room without being fully inside the moment. He turned his head. He looked at Lydia. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the next glass. But every line of her had gone tight in the way a person goes tight when they are working very hard at appearing normal shoulders level. Jaw soft, hands steady, the whole careful architecture of someone who has learned that showing pain gives other people something to use. He knew she'd heard every word. He knew what Beatrice's invitation was designed to do. He set his glass down, he drew breath, he said nothing. "Well, Ashcombe?" Beatrice said pleasantly. "Your household. Your invitation." The silence was only 3 seconds long. Nathaniel would count them later, lying awake Thursday night. He would count them and arrive at 3, and understand that 3 seconds had been long enough to make a decision he would spend a long time trying to earn back. "If Miss Mercer wishes to attend," he said carefully. "She may." It was the most cowardly sentence he had ever spoken. He knew it before the last word was out of his mouth. Beatrice smiled. Wonderful. Lydia walked to the sideboard and set the decanter down. Her hand shook once beneath the tray, one small contained tremor. There and gone in less than a second. Nathaniel saw it. He picked up his wineglass and looked at the far wall and said nothing. And that silence settled into his chest, like a stone he could not find a way to put down. That night the guests retired and the candles were collected, and the dining room went back to its formal dark quiet. And Lydia went upstairs to her room and pulled the leather bag from under her bed. She didn't light a candle. She didn't need to. She had packed this bag enough to do it by feel the second dress first. Folded flat. Then her father's lexicon wrapped in cloth because the binding was soft at the spine. 2 pairs of stockings. A small bottle of ink. A hairbrush with 3 missing teeth. The letter of reference from the Massachusetts schoolmaster. Folded 4 times, tucked into the inner pocket. She was gone before breakfast. Before Thursday. Before Beatrice Whitlock could arrange 9 people in a room and charge them nothing to watch a serving girl try to hold a dessert fork correctly. The knock came when the bag was half buckled. "I can hear that clasp from the 3rd step," Margaret Bellows said through the door. Lydia didn't answer. "I'm coming in regardless," Margaret said. "So you may as well open it." Margaret Bellows was 57 and built the way certain women are built, not large, but immovable, the kind of solid that comes from 4 decades of refusing to be moved by things she found inconvenient. She had served Blackthorn Hall since before Nathaniel inherited it. She had a way of looking at people that combined complete impartiality with total comprehension. Like a judge who already knew the verdict but was willing to let you finish your argument. She came in without being invited. She sat in the chair by the window. She looked at the bag. "Leaving before dawn," she said. "Before breakfast," Lydia said. "No fuss. I'll write a notice and leave it with the morning tray. And where will you go? Find another position." "In the middle of October," Margaret said. "With no character reference from the house you left without notice. I'll manage. I know you can manage." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "That was never the question. The question is what story gets told about you after you're gone." She let that sit a beat. "Right now Mrs. Whitlock has a story about a maid who borrowed books above her station. Mildly amusing. Forgotten by Christmas. But if you leave Thursday morning, she gets a better story. The educated maid who ran away when she was tested. That story doesn't stay in this county. She corresponds with half the great houses in England." Lydia sat on the edge of the bed. The bag was between her feet. She looked at it. "What am I supposed to do?" she said. "Walk into that room and answer their questions like a trained animal. Let them applaud themselves for discovering an unusually clever servant." "No," Margaret said. "Walk in and give them something they can't categorize." "I have nothing appropriate to wear." "I know." Margaret stood. Something shifted in her expression, not hesitation exactly. More like a woman approaching a decision she had been turning over for some time and had finally arrived at. "Come with me." 2 flights up. A corridor Lydia had never cleaned. Past rooms with closed doors that had been closed for 8 years. Margaret stopped at a cedar wardrobe at the end of a dressing room that still smelled of lavender and something warmer underneath rosewater. Maybe, or the ghost of it. She opened the wardrobe and removed a flat wooden box. She set it on the dressing table. She lifted the lid. The gown was ivory and deep blue silk. Even in the thin hallway light it was extraordinary, not merely expensive but authoritative. The kind of garment, made by someone who understood that clothing could confer a status that nothing else could replicate or remove. Lydia looked at it. Then she looked at Margaret's face. "Whose dress is that?" she said. Not a question, she already half knew. "The last Duchess of Ashcombe," Margaret said. Lydia stepped back. "No. Listen, absolutely not. She said it the way she said things when she needed them understood without discussion. Quiet. Clear, final. I am not wearing a dead woman's clothes to a dinner where people intend to make a fool of me. That is not I won't do that to her memory, and I won't do it to him. Evelyn wore that gown at her last public dinner at this house, Margaret said. Her voice was steady. She died 4 months later. His Grace hasn't touched this room since the funeral. He hasn't forbidden anyone from opening it. He's simply never been able to open it himself. That's exactly why. Let me finish. Margaret looked at her directly. When you walk into that dining room Thursday night, Beatrice Whitlock has already decided who you are. She decided it before she finished her sentence at the table. She has 9 people ready to see a serving girl playing dress-up. The moment you step through that door in your gray wool dress, they've stopped seeing you before you've spoken a single word. Lydia was silent. That gown, Margaret said, belonged to a woman who ran this estate with more intelligence and genuine care than anyone in that dining room will ever give her credit for. Wearing it doesn't make you Evelyn. It makes them pause long enough to actually look at you. It'll wound him, Lydia said quietly. Yes. He let that invitation happen. He was sitting right there. I know what he did, Margaret said. Then why should I protect him from this? Margaret said. I'm not asking you to protect him. I'm asking you to walk into that room as someone they cannot reduce to a category before you've opened your mouth. What it costs him is his own responsibility. He made his choice Tuesday night. Now you make yours. Lydia looked at the gown for a long time. She looked at the door. Put it away, she said. I'll think on it. Margaret closed the box without argument and replaced it in the wardrobe. Don't think too long, she said. Thursday comes whether you're ready or not. She didn't sleep. She sat at the work table in her room with the lexicon open across her lap, not reading. Just holding it, the way she did when she needed something solid under her hands. Her father had carried it from Boston to 3 different rented rooms and finally to England. And it had his handwriting in the margins, small, careful notes in Latin and English both. The kind of notations a man makes when he is teaching himself something and wants to hold the thought still long enough to examine it. He had believed, with a sincerity that had sometimes embarrassed her when she was young, that a mind was a mind regardless of where it was housed. She had inherited that belief. She had also inherited the knowledge that the world did not share it, which was a harder thing to carry than the belief itself. She put the lexicon down at 3:30, and then she thought about the notebook. She'd found it 6 days ago behind a loose panel in the 3rd cabinet on the left, tucked flat against the back wall, leather-bound, dark green. The cover worn soft at the corners. She had been reorganizing the estate ledgers because the disorder in them had been quietly driving her to distraction for months, and her hand caught the edge of something that wasn't a ledger at all. The handwriting inside was careful and compact, not an accountant's handwriting, something more attentive than that. Names of tenant families, harvest records, a note about a child who had died of fever in a flooded cottage. A letter copied out in full, word for word, from a widow who couldn't pay her lease after her husband's accident. Questions about drainage, observations about soil. A list of the estate's children who attended school that year and those who hadn't, with a small notation beside each absent name explaining why. She had read it in the cold library at 5:30 in the morning and understood, before she reached the 3rd page, that whoever had written it had understood something rare. That the people who worked the land had lives that deserved to be recorded with the same care as the financial accounts of those who owned it. She had replaced the notebook carefully behind the panel. She had not mentioned it to anyone, but she had not stopped thinking about it either. And now at 3:30 in the morning, sitting alone with her father's book on her lap, she admitted to herself that the notebook was at least part of why she was still here. Still at Blackthorn. Still in this particular room in this particular house instead of somewhere simpler. Somewhere safer. Somewhere that didn't require her to be invisible every moment of every waking day. Whoever had written that notebook had not been invisible. Whoever had written it had looked directly at the world and written down exactly what she saw. Lydia put her palm flat on the surface of the worn wooden shelf beside her. She felt the grain of it. She made a decision. She got up and went and knocked on Margaret's door. "Show me the dress again," she said. Thursday arrived without ceremony. Lydia spent most of the afternoon in the library because it was the only room in the house where she could think without performing the act of thinking for someone else's benefit. She sat at the long work table by the east window, not in the reading chair. She'd never been quite comfortable claiming it and tried to stay still inside herself. The afternoon light moved across the table. The house made its small sounds. Somewhere below, someone carried a tray across the marble floor of the entrance hall. At 6 o'clock, Margaret appeared in the library doorway. She had the wooden box under her arm. She looked at Lydia and waited. Lydia stood up, she said. The gown fit with only small adjustments at the waist. Lydia stood in front of the narrow glass and looked at herself for a long moment without speaking. She did not look like a maid. She looked like a woman who had decided to take up space. "Don't hesitate at the door," Margaret said from behind her. "Walk in as though you expected to arrive exactly where you've arrived. What if I don't know the answer to something they ask? Say so plainly." The ability to admit you don't know something is rarer in that room than the ability to know it. They'll respect the honesty without understanding why. Lydia looked at her own reflection. Did Evelyn ever wear this when people were unkind to her? Margaret was quiet a moment. Once. A county gathering in her second year here. Several of the older families hadn't accepted her yet. She walked in wearing that gown, and she was so thoroughly herself that by the end of the evening 3 of them had asked for her opinion on something. A pause. None of them mentioned the earlier unpleasantness again. What did she do when they were rude to her? She answered them pleasantly and asked them questions about themselves. There is nothing more disarming to a person who expects anger than genuine interest. Lydia looked at the door. "I'm ready," she said. The dining room was lit and waiting. 9 guests were already seated. Beatrice sat at Nathaniel's right hand wearing dark green silk and an expression of pleasant anticipation that she had not bothered to conceal because she saw no reason to. Nathaniel was standing near the window when the door opened. He had been standing there for 20 minutes, which was not his habit. But the evening had given him a restless energy he didn't know what else to do with. He had told himself on Tuesday night, and again Wednesday morning, and again that afternoon, that he would speak to Beatrice. That he would find the right moment, the right diplomatic phrasing, and explain that the invitation had been spoken carelessly, and that the evening would proceed as normal. He had not done it. The honest accounting of why was not comfortable. He had not done it because stopping Beatrice would have required him to declare, in front of 8 other people, that he had agreed to something he found objectionable. It would have required exposure of a kind he had spent 8 years carefully avoiding. Easier to let the evening happen. Easier to trust that Lydia was resilient. That the evening would be uncomfortable but brief. That by Friday it would be a minor anecdote and nothing more. He had let himself believe that because believing it cost him nothing. He was looking at the window when the doors opened and the room went silent. Not gradually, like a lamp extinguished. He turned. Lydia Mercer stood in the doorway wearing the ivory and deep blue silk gown that had belonged to Evelyn. He knew the dress before he fully saw it, the way you recognize certain music before you've consciously heard it. From somewhere below thought. He knew the precise weight of the fabric at the collar where the button fastened. Because he had fumbled with that button himself on an October night 8 years ago, while Evelyn laughed at him for being clumsy. He knew the way the blue caught candlelight. He knew the particular way the silk moved. He stood up so fast, his chair went backward and struck the floor. He stood there and he looked at her, at the dress. Back at her. Nothing came. Beatrice Whitlock, who had arranged this entire evening with the serene confidence of a woman for whom surprises were things that happened to other people. had gone completely still. For 4 full seconds she said nothing. That had not happened to Beatrice in a very long time. Then Lydia walked in. She did not pause in the doorway for effect. She did not look around to measure the room's reaction. She walked in with the steadiness of a woman who is afraid and has decided that being afraid is not sufficient reason to stop moving. She crossed the threshold and stopped and looked directly at Beatrice. "You invited me," she said, "because you wanted to discover what a maid knows. 1 step forward." "Shall we begin?" The silence broke like something physical, not with laughter but with the uncomfortable sound of people shifting in their seats, readjusting their understanding of an evening they thought they had planned. Beatrice recovered in 4 seconds. Whatever else she was experienced at recovery. "Miss Mercer," her voice was perfectly pleasant. "How entirely unexpected to come and sit down." The indicated chair was at the foot of the table. The message was delivered without a word being wasted on it. Lydia sat. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Nathaniel remained standing for 2 full seconds before he made himself sit down. He picked up his wineglass, set it down untouched. A man named Cavendish, red-faced, affable, the kind of good humor that never has to try very hard, leaned forward. "Well, Miss Mercer, we hear you're quite the scholar, Mrs. Whitlock is generous," Lydia said. "I read when I'm able." She said. "Yes, which part?" "The annals. Specifically Tiberius's later reign, the way power consolidates itself through prosecution rather than direct opposition. It's a remarkably instructive pattern. A system can corrupt entirely without any single act being provably criminal." Cavendish blinked, then laughed. The slightly delayed laugh of a man who has just realized a remark was sharper than it appeared. "Well, yes, I suppose it can," Beatrice said pleasantly. "What a particular passage to have selected." "I wasn't selecting particularly. I read the earlier sections last month. I was working through it in order. You read Latin, my father taught it. And Greek, and basic accounting, and whatever else was needed in the schoolhouse where he worked. He believed a mind was worth developing regardless of whose head it happened to occupy." "How charming," Beatrice said. "And your father, he was a schoolmaster in America." "Massachusetts." "Yes, and a bookkeeper after the school could no longer pay him." "An American." Beatrice said it with the mild inflection of someone noting a slightly unusual species. "That explains your manner of speaking." "My accent explains my accent," Lydia said. "Yes." Across the table, a small white-haired woman named Mrs. Pruitt pressed her lips together. Beatrice shifted. "Tell me, Miss Mercer, since you read so widely, what is your view of the current parliamentary reform discussions? Surely a woman of your reading has an opinion." Lydia recognized the structure of the question immediately. Answer incorrectly and they laugh. Answer too correctly and Beatrice corrects her in front of everyone. Either way, the round belongs to Beatrice. "I have views," Lydia said. "I'm curious why you'd like to hear them." Beatrice tilted her head. "Simple interest." "You asked," Lydia said, "because you'd like to discover whether I'll say something that embarrasses myself or something that embarrasses the room. If it's the former, you're entertained. If it's the latter, you correct me publicly and restore the evening's balance." She looked at Beatrice steadily. "I want you to understand that I know precisely why I was invited to this table. Mrs. Whitlock, I would rather be examined honestly than humored as though I were too ignorant to recognize the difference." The room went very still. Nathaniel's hand stopped moving on the table. Beatrice said. After a moment, "That is quite a forthright observation for a dinner guest." "You're right," Lydia said. "I'll answer your question. The reform discussions interest me as a problem of documented evidence, specifically whether those with decision-making authority will use the evidence that already exists, or wait for evidence that arrives at a more convenient time. That is a question that applies equally to legislation and to most decisions made by people in comfortable positions." She let it rest a moment. "What is your view, Mrs. Whitlock?" Beatrice said. "I support measured progress." "Yes," Lydia said pleasantly. In my experience, people in comfortable positions tend to support progress at precisely the pace that does not require them to be uncomfortable. Mrs. Pruitt did not manage to conceal her expression this time. Cavendish said, loudly, into the silence that followed. "I say, Ashcombe, where on earth did you find this woman?" Nathaniel said. "She found us." Beatrice regrouped with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has never lost an important social battle and did not intend to start. "Miss Mercer," she said, resetting her tone to something warmer. More instructive, the register of a woman explaining something to someone who cannot be expected to understand without guidance. "I wonder if you might share your thoughts on the natural ordering of society. Aristotle addresses it rather definitively. Surely you've encountered his argument." There it was. The question designed to place Lydia inside the hierarchy she had just implicitly criticized. Agree with Aristotle and endorse the system that put her below these people. Disagree and reveal herself as dangerous, as someone who resented her proper place. Lydia was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "I've read it once," she said. "I don't know that text as well as the Tacitus." Beatrice's chin lifted slightly. But I'll confess the argument troubles me," Lydia continued. "Not the conclusion, the foundation. Aristotle's case for natural hierarchy rests on the premise that natural capacity is accurately reflected by current social position. That every person in a lower position is there because their genuine abilities are genuinely lower." She looked at Beatrice. "Do you find that premise holds up in your observation of the world?" "Mrs. Whitlock?" Beatrice said. "I beg your pardon?" "It seems to me," Lydia said, her voice entirely even, "that if natural capacity were reliably reflected by social position, we would expect to find that every person currently in a comfortable position arrived there through demonstrable merit. And every person in a difficult position arrived there through demonstrable deficiency." She paused. "I've kept enough household accounts to know that inheritance and accident account for a considerable portion of the arrangement. Which makes me wonder whether Aristotle was describing reality or constructing a justification for it." Nobody spoke. Beatrice's jaw had tightened in a way that her expression did not quite conceal. Cavendish cleared his throat and changed the subject, and the table followed him gratefully. But the room had shifted. Something in the balance of the evening had moved. Quietly and permanently, and everyone felt it without being able to say precisely when it had happened. Toward the end of dinner, Lydia's attention moved to a manuscript volume propped near the centerpiece at Nathaniel's end of the table, used as decoration. The way beautiful things sometimes are when no one intends to read them. She could see the handwriting from where she sat. She recognized it. The same compact, attentive hand from the green leather notebook behind the third cabinet panel. She said, carefully, the handwriting in that volume. "Whose is it?" The table registered the question differently than it had registered the others. Something in Nathaniel's face changed. "My wife's," he said. His voice was level. "She was documenting estate records. She used that as a working journal." A pause. "Before she died. The same hand appears throughout the library ledgers," Lydia said quietly. "I noticed it some months ago. I hadn't known whose it was. You've been through the ledgers. I reorganize them sometimes when they fall out of order." "I know it wasn't asked of me. I'll stop if you prefer." "No," Nathaniel said. The word came out before he'd considered it. "Don't stop." Beatrice said something bright and social that steered the table forward. But the moment had already closed itself, like a door swinging gently shut. Lydia had seen the grief cross Nathaniel's face for the 3 seconds it existed before he controlled it. He had seen her see it. Neither of them said anything further. After dinner in the corridor outside the dining room, Mrs. Pruitt caught Lydia's arm as the guests gathered their wraps. "Well handled, honestly handled," Lydia said. "I'm not sure they're the same." "They rarely are, Mrs. Pruitt said. But the honest version was considerably more memorable. She patted Lydia's arm once and moved away. Lydia went upstairs. She changed out of the gown with careful hands. She folded it the way you fold something borrowed, attentive to every seam, every inch of fabric. She carried it back to Margaret's room and set it on the chair. Margaret looked at her. "Well, they examined me," Lydia said. "I examined them back. And His Grace?" Lydia thought about the chair crashing backward. About 3 seconds of grief in a man's face before he remembered to close it away. About the sentence she found us spoken into a silence he had not tried to fill with anything more comfortable. "He knows what Tuesday cost," she said. "He knew it before tonight. But now he knows that I know it too. What will you do with that?" "I don't know yet," Lydia said. "But I'm not leaving." She went back to her room. The bag was still on the bed, half buckled from the night before. She looked at it for a moment, then she unbuckled it fully and began unpacking the second dress. The lexicon, the stockings, the ink, the hairbrush, the letter from the Massachusetts schoolmaster, and laid each thing back in its ordinary place on the shelf with the particular deliberateness of a woman making a decision with her hands since words for it had not yet arrived. She sat on the edge of the bed when she was done. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees around Blackthorn Hall. Somewhere below, a door closed softly. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, the particular stillness of a place that holds too much history in its walls to ever be fully silent. Lydia put her palm flat on the worn wooden shelf beside her. She thought about the green notebook, the widow's letter copied out in full, the child's name with the small notation beside it, explaining why he hadn't been in school that year. She thought about a woman who had looked directly at the world and written down exactly what she saw. She thought someone should finish that. She did not yet think. "I will." But she was close. She was considerably closer than she had been that morning. And in the morning, everything would begin to move. The morning after the dinner, Lydia was back at the work table in the library before 6 o'clock. She had not planned it as a statement. She simply could not sleep past 5. Had never been able to, and the library was the only room in Blackthorn Hall where the silence felt productive rather than oppressive. She pulled the estate ledgers from the second shelf, the ones she had been quietly reorganizing for the past 3 months, and spread them across the table and began working through the rental accounts for the Eastern parcels. She had been at it for 40 minutes when she heard the door. Nathaniel Ashcombe stood in the library doorway in his morning coat. Holding a cup of coffee he had clearly made himself because no member of the household staff arrived until 7. He looked at her. He looked at the ledgers spread across his work table. He looked at her again. "You're here early," he said. "I'm always here early," Lydia said. She did not look up from the ledger. "You've simply never come down before 7. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came in and sat in the chair across from her, not the reading chair. The straight-back chair near the window, which was somehow the more honest choice, and set his coffee down and looked at the ledgers. "Miss Mercer," he said, "Your Grace, I owe you an apology." She looked up then. She looked at him directly the way she had learned to look at people who said things she needed to hear clearly, without expression, without offering them anything to read before they had finished. "Yes," she said, "you do." He absorbed that without flinching, which told her something. A man who expected to be forgiven for apologizing would have looked momentarily wrong-footed by her agreement. Nathaniel simply nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had already known. "Tuesday night," he said. "I knew what that invitation was the moment Beatrice made it. I knew you were standing 6 feet away. I knew you had heard every word." He paused. "And I calculated what it would cost me to stop it. And I decided the cost was too high." Lydia kept looking at him. "That is worse," she said, "than disliking me." "Yes," he said. "I know that. A man who dislikes someone acts from feeling. That I can understand. What you did was arithmetic. You weighed my dignity against your comfort, and you chose your comfort deliberately and with full information." She closed the ledger. "That is not a small thing to admit, Your Grace." "No," he said. "It isn't." The fire in the grate had burned down to its quieter morning level. Outside the east window, the light was coming in flat and pale the way it did in late October. That particular English light that never quite convinces you it has fully arrived. Then say the rest of it, Lydia said. He looked at her. You have something else to tell me, she said. You came down here before 6 in the morning and made your own coffee, and you've been sitting there for 3 minutes working up to something. Say it. Something shifted in his face, not quite amusement, but the near neighbor of it, the expression of a man who has just been seen more clearly than he anticipated. I found Evelyn's notebooks, he said, last night. After everyone had gone, Lydia went still. I hadn't opened that cabinet in 8 years, he said. But after dinner, after what you said about the handwriting in the ledgers, I went to the library after midnight, and I opened it. He looked at the table. There were 14 notebooks. I read until 4 in the morning. The fire crackled once. Neither of them moved. She was building something, Nathaniel said quietly. A complete record, every tenant family on the estate. Their histories, their losses, their children's names. The widow on the north parcel whose husband died in the field and who wrote me 3 letters about the lease that I never personally answered. He stopped. My solicitor answered them. I did not know the details. I told myself I did not need to know the details. But Evelyn knew them, Lydia said. Evelyn knew all of them. He looked up. She had been working on it for 2 years before she died. She never told me the full scope of it because she thought I would tell her it was not a proper use of her time. A pause. She was probably right. Lydia said nothing. She was often right about things I was not ready to hear, he said. That sat in the room for a moment. Then Nathaniel said, I want to offer you work, Miss Mercer. She did not answer immediately, which was the correct instinct. A woman who answered immediately would be a woman who had been waiting to be offered something. Lydia had not been waiting. She had been working in the ledgers for 3 months because the disorder in them bothered her. Not because she had been angling for a position. The distinction mattered. Tell me what the work is first, she said. Evelyn's project. The estate record. 14 notebooks of collected material. Incomplete, unorganized, covering roughly 60 years of tenant history. I want it finished, compiled, written into a form that can be preserved and eventually consulted. He looked at her steadily. I have been trying to find someone capable of it for 8 years. I have not been looking very hard, which is its own kind of answer. Why me? Because you already read the ledgers without being asked. Because you found her handwriting across 4 different volumes and recognized it as the work of a single mind before you knew whose mind it was. Because you sat at that dinner table last night and demonstrated more genuine understanding of evidence and record and social consequence than anyone else in the room. He paused. And because you put the notebook back where you found it and said nothing to anyone. She looked at him sharply. I moved the cabinet last month, he said. The notebook was slightly different from how I had left it. I knew someone had found it. You said nothing. I was waiting to see what you would do. She considered this. It was not entirely comfortable to realize she had been observed while she thought herself unobserved. But she could not fault the method. It was exactly what she would have done. How long have you been considering offering me this work? She asked. He did not look away. 8 months. 8 months, she said. Yes. And what stopped you? He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. Scandal, he said. Moving a maid into a professional research position in a private household, a female maid. An unmarried one, an American. The conversation that would produce in this county was one I did not feel prepared to manage. Lydia looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. And then she understood something that landed with the particular unpleasantness of a truth that reframes something you had not fully examined. She understood that Beatrice's dinner invitation, the humiliation, the 9 guests, the examination of the educated serving girl had accidentally done for Nathaniel what he had not been willing to do for himself. It had pushed her across a social boundary in public. It had made her visible in a new category before he had to formally create the category. It had given him permission to offer her this work without having been the one to first suggest she was capable of it. She had not been protected by his silence on Tuesday night. She had been used by it. You let it happen, she said slowly. Not just because stopping it was uncomfortable, but because you knew, or some part of you understood, that if Beatrice forced the conversation, you wouldn't have to. He did not deny it. That was the moment that mattered. Not the apology, not the coffee, not the 14 notebooks. The moment he chose not to construct a more flattering version of what had occurred. I did not plan it consciously, he said. I want to be clear about that. But I cannot honestly claim I was ignorant of what I was allowing. Lydia stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the pale October morning for a moment. Her hands were at her sides, her breathing was even. She was thinking about her father's voice, specifically the way he used to say that a man's character was not revealed in his intentions, but in what he chose to do when the honest accounting of his intentions became inconvenient. She turned around. What would you pay a man to do this work, she said. Nathaniel told her the figure. She said, then pay me that. He nodded immediately. He had been prepared for that answer. He had thought about it. She realized he had come down here at 6 in the morning with his homemade coffee because he had thought very carefully about this conversation. There are conditions, she said. Tell me, I leave domestic service today. Formally, in writing, with a proper notice and a proper accounting of what I'm owed from the household accounts. She watched his face. I find accommodation in the village. I will not live under your roof as an employee of your household while doing work that requires my professional independence. The two things cannot coexist without the second thing destroying the first. Agreed. My working hours are documented. The library remains open during those hours. Every payment is recorded dates. Amounts, what the payment is for, she paused. And when the project is complete, I receive written certification describing exactly what I did. Not a letter of character reference. A professional document. My name, the work, the dates. Signed by you and by your solicitor, Nathaniel said. Theodore Graves. Yes. He will want to meet you first. That's reasonable. He may have questions about your qualifications. He may ask them, Lydia said. I will answer them. And then he can decide whether a woman who taught herself bookkeeping from her father's ledgers reorganized 3 years of your estate accounts without being asked, and read 14 volumes of classical history in a language she learned before she was 12, to organize and complete a written historical record. She held his gaze. He can decide that for himself. Nathaniel looked at her. For the first time since Tuesday night, something in his face settled, not relief exactly, but something that had been wound tight, beginning to ease. All right, he said. All right, she said. She picked up the ledger she had closed and opened it again. I'll finish the Eastern parcel accounts this morning, she said. They're 3 months behind, and 2 of the figures don't reconcile. After that, I'll need access to the cabinet with the notebooks. Nathaniel stood. He picked up his coffee. Miss Mercer, she looked up. Thank you, he said, for not leaving Thursday morning. I nearly did, she said. I know. He turned for the door. I'm glad Margaret has good hearing. He left. The library door swung quietly behind him. Lydia looked at the ledger. Then she looked at the third cabinet from the left. Then she went back to the figures that didn't reconcile. Because a decision made was a decision made, and the Eastern parcel accounts were not going to balance themselves. Theodore Graves arrived at Blackthorn Hall on a Wednesday morning 11 days later. And he arrived, Lydia could tell immediately, with his mind already made up. He was 61, compact, precise in his movements the way lawyers are when they have spent decades understanding that imprecision is expensive. He had small eyes that moved quickly and a way of holding his hat that suggested he considered most situations more complicated than other people recognized them to be. He looked at Lydia across the library table, and she could see him doing his arithmetic American. Female, former household staff, no formal institutional credentials, and arriving at a number that was lower than the one she intended to give him. His Grace tells me you've been working through the estate ledgers, Graves said. Yes. On your own initiative. Yes. May I ask, because they were in poor order, and poor order in financial records creates errors that compound over time. She gestured to the stack of reorganized ledgers at the end of the table. The Eastern parcel accounts had a discrepancy of £43 across 18 months that no one had noticed. I found it last week. Graves looked at the ledgers. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. £43, he said, distributed across 6 entries over 18 months. Small enough in each instance to look like rounding. Large enough in aggregate to be meaningful. She opened the top ledger to the page she had marked and turned it so he could read it. I've documented where each discrepancy occurs and what the corrected figure should be. Graves looked at the page for a long moment. He said, "Who taught you bookkeeping?" "My father taught me the theory. Practice taught me the rest. Your father was a schoolmaster and a bookkeeper. He believed in being useful in more than one direction." Graves set the ledger down. He looked at her with the particular look of a man revising his arithmetic in real time and not entirely pleased about the revision because it required him to admit his first calculation had been wrong. "The Duchess's notebooks," he said. "Have you reviewed them? The ones in the third cabinet?" "Yes. All 14. I've done a preliminary inventory date. Subject areas, completion status, by section." She produced a 4-page document she had written over the past week and set it in front of him. The material spans 63 years. The most complete sections cover tenant lease histories and harvest records. The least complete are the medical cost records and the school attendance figures, which appear to have been begun in the last 6 months of the Duchess's life and are fragmentary. Graves picked up the 4 pages. He read them. He read them more carefully than he had read anything in a while. She could tell from the way his eyes slowed down. "You did this in 11 days, he said. 10. I spent the first day on the Eastern parcel accounts. He set the document down. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I will be honest with you. When His Grace described this arrangement, I had significant reservations." "I know," she said. "You know. You arrived with your mind already formed. That's a reasonable response to an unusual situation." "I'm not offended by caution, Mr. Graves. I'm offended by caution that refuses to revise itself in the presence of evidence." Graves looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face that she could not immediately classify, not quite amusement, not quite respect, but somewhere between the two, in the territory of a man who has just been addressed in a way he did not expect and finds it more invigorating than irritating. "I will need to document everything," he said. "The terms of your engagement, the scope of the work, payment schedule, professional certification upon completion. Those were my conditions when I spoke with His Grace," Lydia said. "We agree on all of them. I will also need to record your existing work on the ledgers. The £43 should be formally documented and corrected in the official accounts." "Yes." "I assumed you'd want that. And I will want quarterly progress reports on the Duchess's project. Written. Dated, also reasonable." Graves straightened his jacket. "I'll have the formal documents prepared by Friday," he said. He picked up his hat. He paused. "The discrepancy in the Eastern parcels, were the errors accidental?" Lydia looked at him. "I believe so. The pattern is consistent with inattention rather than intent. But you should review them yourself and reach your own conclusion." Graves nodded slowly. "Good answer," he said, and left. Lydia looked at the closed door for a moment. Then she opened the nearest notebook and went back to work. Blackthorn Hall began talking within a week. Not the staff. The staff had their own networks and their own conclusions, and most of them, Lydia suspected, had known she was unusual long before Tuesday's dinner. It was the county that talked. The county had been present at the dinner in the form of 9 guests, who each had their own households and their own correspondence. And by the following Saturday, the story had traveled in at least 4 directions simultaneously. The version Beatrice Whitlock circulated was the most elegant, and therefore the most damaging. It did not say anything overtly false. It simply arranged the true facts in a particular order. A former maid, now installed in the Duke's private library, given access to his late wife's personal papers, paid from his household accounts, living in the village on an arrangement nobody could quite explain. The implication was placed without being stated, which is always the most effective method. Lydia heard it from Margaret on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the flat economy of a woman who considered gossip a form of weather worth noting. Impossible to stop. You knew this would happen, Margaret said. It was not an accusation. Yes, Lydia said. And I am not going to stop working because people have drawn an inaccurate conclusion about why I'm working. She turned a page in Evelyn's notebook. If I stop every time someone misunderstands my reasons, I will stop constantly. I do not have time to stop constantly. Margaret looked at her. His Grace needs to say something publicly. His Grace will say what he decides to say when he decides to say it, Lydia said. I am not going to ask him to defend me. I am going to do work that does not require defending. But privately, in the cold quiet of her rented room above the village bakery, where she worked by lamplight until 10 most evenings, she understood that Margaret was right in a way that her own stubbornness was trying to obscure. The gossip was not simply uncomfortable, it had a specific shape, and that shape was designed to make everything she accomplished look like something that had been given to her, rather than earned. That was the real danger. Not that people thought she was Nathaniel's mistress, she could endure being misunderstood. The danger was that every page of Evelyn's project she completed could be reframed, in the telling, as the Duke's project that his dependent had transcribed for him. That the work could be drained of her authorship before it was finished. She thought about that for 3 straight evenings. Then she went to see Nathaniel. She found him in the estate office, which was where he worked when he was trying to think, rather than simply exist inside his own house. He looked up when she came in and waited, in the way he had developed over the past weeks of working alongside her, the habit of letting her arrive at the point in her own time, rather than anticipating it before she was ready. The gossip is specific, she said. I want you to understand what it is before you decide whether to address it. I know what it is, he said. Then you know it has a particular strategic function. It is not random unkindness. It is designed to ensure that whatever I complete under this arrangement can be attributed to your patronage rather than my work. She looked at him steadily. If that happens, the project loses most of its value. Not its historical value, the records are what they are. But its meaning, what it can demonstrate. Nathaniel said. About Evelyn's intentions. About the possibility that a woman working carefully and methodically can produce something worth preserving. She paused. That is what Evelyn was trying to prove when she began it. I don't think she articulated it that way. But that is what the project is. Nathaniel was quiet. What do you want me to do? He said. I want you to tell Theodore Graves to make the employment documentation available to anyone who asks. Not publicly distributed, simply available. Dates, terms, payment records. Anyone who wishes to verify the nature of the arrangement should be able to do so without being refused. Done. And I want you to tell me the truth about something. He looked at her. Julian, she said. The name landed differently than the others had. She saw it. Nathaniel set down his pen. My cousin has concerns. Tell me what they are. He believes Nathaniel stopped. Began again. Julian is not a cruel man. He is a cautious one. He believes that my judgment has been affected by the unusual circumstances of the dinner, and that I am making a decision I would not otherwise make, and that the decision has implications for the estate that I am not fully considering. He thinks you're besotted, Lydia said. He did not use that word. What word did he use? Nathaniel said. Lydia almost laughed. And are you compromised? Nathaniel looked at her directly. I am considerably more certain of your abilities and your independence than I was 8 months ago, when I first considered offering you this work and decided against it. Whether that constitutes compromise or correction, I leave to your judgment. She thought about that. Julian's concern is not irrational, she said finally. If the gossip is correct, if this arrangement is what Beatrice is suggesting it is, then the estate's reputation suffers and his inheritance prospects suffer with it. Those are real stakes. I'm not going to dismiss them because I find them inconvenient. That is a remarkably generous reading of a man who has been making your life difficult. I'm not generous, Lydia said. I'm accurate. There's a difference. She stood. I'll speak to Mr. Graves about the documentation, and I'll have a preliminary written report on the project scope ready by the end of the month. Lydia, she stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. She didn't think he had noticed he'd done it until he said it. And she could see from his expression that he had noticed immediately afterward. Miss Mercer, he corrected himself. It's all right, she said. And left before either of them had to decide what to do with the silence that would have followed. She worked through November with the particular focused intensity she had learned from her father, who had once graded examination papers from 6 in the morning until midnight 3 days running because the county schools required results by a fixed date, and he was not a man who missed a fixed date. The 14 notebooks were not organized chronologically, which was the first problem. Evelyn had worked associatively, following a name or a family through multiple volumes before returning to the broader record. It was a natural way to think and a difficult way to compile. Lydia built a ledger of her own, a cross-reference index, names and dates and notebook numbers, so that every mention of every family could be located across all 14 volumes without having to read all 14 volumes from the beginning each time. It took 3 weeks. It was meticulous and slightly maddening, and when she finished it, she sat back and looked at it and felt a satisfaction so complete it almost surprised her. Evelyn's handwriting became familiar over those weeks, the way a voice becomes familiar, not the surface characteristics, but the patterns underneath. The way she used a dash when she was uncertain of a date. The way she underlined a name twice when she considered the person's story particularly important. The way her handwriting got smaller and more compressed toward the end of each notebook, as though she was aware she was running out of pages and trying to fit more in. There was one entry that Lydia came back to 3 times. A woman named Agnes Harrow, tenant on the south parcel, whose husband had died in the winter of 1798, leaving her with 4 children and a lease she could not meet. Agnes had written to the estate 3 times. The first 2 letters were formal, measured, the careful language of a woman who understood that she was asking for something, and that asking incorrectly would guarantee refusal. The 3rd letter was not formal. The 3rd letter was the letter of a woman who had run out of careful language. Evelyn had copied all 3 letters out in full. At the bottom of the 3rd she had written, "The lease was not renewed. I do not know where Agnes Harrow went after February. I have tried to find out and cannot. This is the record's greatest failure, that the people who most needed to be remembered are the ones most likely to disappear from it." Lydia read that sentence 4 times. Then she set the notebook down and sat with it for a while. She thought, this is why, not why Evelyn had begun the project. That was clear enough. Evelyn had begun it from conscience and from the conviction that record-keeping was a form of justice. But this sentence about Agnes Harrow disappearing from the record, this was why it needed to be finished. Because the people who most needed to be remembered were the ones most likely to disappear. And disappearing from the record was its own kind of erasure. And erasure was not neutral. It was a choice that someone made or failed to make. And Lydia was here, and she had chosen. She opened the notebook again and kept working. Julian Ashcombe came to the library on a Thursday afternoon in late November without announcement, which was his way of indicating he considered himself entitled to arrive unannounced. He was 34, lean, with Nathaniel's coloring and a more mobile, more watchful version of Nathaniel's face, the face of a man who was accustomed to being in rooms where decisions were made without him, and had developed a sharply calibrated awareness of that fact. He stood in the doorway and looked at the library, the notebooks spread across the table, the cross-reference ledger, the stack of completed sections on the left side, The uncompleted material on the right, Miss Mercer, he said. Mr. Ashcombe, she said. She did not put her pen down. I've been wanting to speak with you. I assumed you would be. Eventually, she said. Sit down if you'd like, he sat. He looked at the notebooks. He said, you found all of those in the cabinets? 14. There may be more in the East Wing storage, but I haven't been given access to those rooms yet. Nathaniel gave you access to Evelyn's papers. He gave me access to the project she was building. The papers are in service of the project. She looked up. What did you want to say, Mr. Ashcombe? Julian's jaw tightened slightly. He was not accustomed to people bringing conversations to their point before he was ready. I want to understand this arrangement. The legal terms are documented with Mr. Graves. He can show you if you ask. I've read the documents, Julian said. I want to understand it, not read it. Lydia set her pen down. She looked at him. You believe this arrangement is what Beatrice Witt says. I don't know what it is. Yes, you do, she said. You're a careful man. You've read the documents. You've observed the arrangement from a distance for 6 weeks. And you've arrived at a conclusion that you're now either seeking confirmation for or hoping to have contradicted. She looked at him steadily. Which is it? Julian looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted the watchful quality becoming. Briefly, something more unguarded. I want to know, he said. More quietly, whether my cousin is thinking clearly. He is, Lydia said. More clearly in my observation than he was before this work began. That is not a reassuring thing to hear from the person most invested in his clarity. No, she said. I suppose it isn't. She thought for a moment, Mr. Ashcombe, your concern is legitimate. I'm not dismissing it. If I were in your position, I would have the same concern. What I would ask you to do is apply the same standard of evidence to this situation that you would apply to any other. Not the standard of what it looks like from the outside. The standard of what the documented facts actually show. And what do the documented facts show? A woman with verifiable skills was offered verifiable paid employment with verifiable legal documentation. She has produced verifiable work output in a verifiable time frame. She gestured to the stack of completed sections. Those are 60 pages. I have been here 6 weeks. You may read every page if you choose. Julian looked at the stack. He looked at the cross-reference ledger. He looked at the index she had built, the months of patient work, visible in its structure to anyone who understood what they were looking at. He said after a long pause, Evelyn tried to do this. She got further than anyone knew, Lydia said. The material is extraordinary. She was an exceptional observer. Julian's throat moved. She was, he said. He picked up the cross-reference ledger, looked at the first page, set it down. She would have finished it herself if she'd had more time. Yes, Lydia said. I believe she would have. Julian stood. He straightened his jacket in the same way Graves had that particular masculine readjustment that meant a conversation was ending, and the person ending it had not entirely resolved what they came to resolve. I'll speak to Graves, he said. That's reasonable, Lydia said. He turned for the door, stopped, did not turn back. The entry about Agnes Harrow, he said, on page 41 of the 6 notebook. Read it. Lydia looked at his back. I've read it, she said quietly. 3 times. Julian nodded. He walked out. Lydia looked at the doorway after he had gone. Then she picked up her pen. She understood something now that she had not understood before he arrived. Julian Ashcombe was not primarily afraid of scandal. He was afraid of the project. Not afraid it would fail, afraid of what it would reveal when it succeeded. Because his grandfather's ledgers were in those cabinets too. And there were entries in Evelyn's notebooks that touched on decisions made in that generation that had cost people like Agnes Harrow everything. And Julian knew it, and he was a man who had loved Evelyn and had just sat across a library table from the woman finishing Evelyn's work and had decided in some quiet internal accounting that he was going to let it happen. That was its own kind of courage. Lydia noted it, filed it away. Went back to the page in front of her. Outside the library, the first real snow of winter was beginning to fall. And inside Blackthorn Hall the house was warm, and the notebooks were open, and Evelyn Ashcombe's careful handwriting covered page after page after page, and Lydia Mercer worked steadily through the afternoon, following every name wherever it led, writing down exactly what she found. 18 months passed the way hard work passes, not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular texture of time that is too full to feel long until you look back and realize how far you have traveled. Lydia had filled 4 notebooks of her own by the time February arrived in the second year. Her handwriting was nothing like Evelyn's, where Evelyn wrote in careful, compressed loops. Lydia wrote in the angular, slightly impatient hand of a woman who thought faster than she could transcribe, and had made a permanent accommodation with that fact. But the notebook sat side by side on the library shelf, Evelyn's dark green and Lydia's plain brown, and anyone who opened them in sequence would understand immediately that they were part of the same project. The same argument, the same insistence that these names and these lives deserved to be preserved. The cross-reference index had grown to 60 pages. The completed sections now occupied 2 full shelves. Theodore Graves had visited 4 times, read every quarterly report, and stopped arriving with his mind already made up sometime around the 3rd visit. And Nathaniel had started bringing her things, not extravagantly, not with any declaration attached. A volume from the upper shelves he thought might contain useful records. A letter he had found in his own correspondence files from a tenant family she had mentioned. A cup of coffee left on the work table at 6 in the morning before she arrived. Still warm when she sat down, he never mentioned the coffee. She never mentioned it either. But it was there every morning. And the understanding that it would be there had become part of how she started her days. She noticed these things. She filed them carefully under a category she had not yet named and did not intend to name until she was ready. She was not ready. There was too much work left, and the work mattered more than the feeling. Because the work would exist after the feeling was either resolved or gone. And she had learned early that feelings without foundation were a luxury she could not afford. Then Beatrice Whitlock came back. She came in March, for a county gathering at Blackthorn that Nathaniel hosted reluctantly every spring because his late father had hosted it before him, and the tradition had the momentum of a very large stone rolling downhill. 23 guests, 3 days. The kind of social event that required the entire house to operate at a different register, more polished, more careful, more aware of itself. Lydia worked through it. She kept to the library during the day and to her room in the evenings. She was no longer staff and therefore not required to serve. And she was not a guest and therefore not required to attend. She occupied the useful middle category of working professional, and she had found, over 18 months, that this category was actually more comfortable than either extreme, because it gave her permission to simply not be present in situations where her presence would create difficulty. She heard Beatrice's voice on the second afternoon through the library door, which was closed but not thick enough to be fully effective. "Still here then," Beatrice was saying, to someone Lydia couldn't identify from the voice. "I had rather thought the arrangement would run its natural course by now," a murmured response. "Oh, I'm not criticizing," Beatrice said pleasantly. "Nathaniel has always had his particular loyalties. One simply wonders how long the county is expected to maintain its equanimity about it." The voices moved away down the corridor. Lydia set her pen down. She looked at the wall. She picked her pen up again. She wrote for another 2 hours without stopping. When she finished the section, she was working on the complete history of the Morrow family. 4 generations. Harvest records and lease renewals, and one remarkable letter from a grandmother who had negotiated a drainage improvement out of the estate in 1763 by threatening to take her case to the county magistrate. She read it back, and it was good. It was better than good. It was the kind of careful, humane, precisely documented history that Evelyn had imagined when she began the project. And Lydia knew it, and she let herself know it without apology. That was its own answer to Beatrice. But it was not the only answer that would be needed. Nathaniel found her in the library at 7 that evening. The guests were at dinner. He had excused himself, which would be noted and commented upon, and she suspected he knew that and had come anyway. "You heard her," he said. "It wasn't a question." "The door is not particularly soundproof," Lydia said. He sat down across from her. He looked tired in a specific way, not physically tired, but the tiredness of a man who has been performing social ease for 2 days and has run through his supply of it. "I should have said something at dinner," he said. "What would you have said?" "I don't know, something, Nathaniel." She used his name. She had started doing that in private, 4 months ago. And he had not corrected her, and she had not apologized. Beatrice Whitlock will say what she says, regardless of what you say at dinner. She is not operating from ignorance, she is operating from a position, and the position does not change in response to your clarifications. Then what changes it? The work, Lydia said. When it's finished and published and exists in the world under a specific name attached to a specific documented history, then it changes. Nathaniel looked at the shelves, at the 2 rows of completed sections, at the notebooks, at the 60-page index she had built from nothing. "How close are you?" he said. "The main text is complete. I'm working on the appendices, the supplementary records that support the historical claims. And there are 2 sections I want to revise before I'm willing to call it finished." She paused. 4 months, perhaps 5, and then? She had been waiting for him to ask that directly. She had known for some time that the question was building. She had known it the way you know weather from the pressure changes. The quality of the silences, the particular way he looked at the work when he thought she wasn't watching. "And then it should be published," she said, "not circulated privately." "Published." Nathaniel was quiet. "I know what that means," she said. "The record contains uncomfortable material about several families in this county, including this one. Your grandfather," she said. "The winter of 1809. The failed harvest and the lease renewals that weren't." He said nothing. "Evelyn documented it," Lydia said, "in detail. 3 families lost their tenancies in February of that year. The Harrow family was one of them. She found the letters they sent. She found the estate's responses. She held his gaze. I didn't alter what she wrote. I verified it and I completed the record around it. I know about 1809, Nathaniel said quietly. I wondered if you did. I found the letters and files when I inherited the estate. I read them once and I put them away. He looked at his hands. I told myself they were history, that there was nothing to be done about them now. There is something to be done about them now, Lydia said. You can allow them to be part of the record, not hidden, not explained away, simply acknowledged as part of what happened here. The fire in the grate shifted. Neither of them moved. If we publish, Nathaniel said slowly, Julian will argue that it exposes the family too. Julian has already read those sections, Lydia said. Nathaniel looked up sharply. He came back in January. He asked to read the completed portions. I let him. She paused. He read for 3 hours. He didn't say much when he finished. But he returned the sections in the same order I'd given them to him, which told me he'd read carefully. Another pause. He hasn't said he opposes publication. He hasn't said he supports it, no. But Julian Ashcombe's silence, in my experience, is not the same as Julian Ashcombe's opposition. He's a man who objects loudly to things he actually objects to. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she could hear the distant sound of silverware from the dining room 2 corridors away. 23 guests eating a dinner their host had abandoned to sit in a library with his estate archivist at 7 in the evening. I'll think about it, he said. It was not the answer she wanted. But it was the honest answer, and she had learned over 18 months that an honest answer from Nathaniel was worth considerably more than a comfortable one. She did not have to wait long for the decision to be forced. Beatrice moved faster than Lydia had anticipated. Not with gossip this time. Beatrice was too intelligent to repeat the same method twice, and too experienced to believe that social implication was sufficient when a more direct instrument was available. She went to Theodore Graves. Lydia found out from Graves himself, who arrived at the library on a Monday morning in April with the tight expression of a man who has just been handed something he considers professionally objectionable. "Mrs. Whitlock has raised a formal concern," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the deliberate precision of a man organizing his thoughts as he sat. "With me in my capacity as His Grace's solicitor. She is suggesting that the project you are completing using the Duchess's personal papers constitutes an unauthorized use of private estate documents, and that any publication derived from those documents would require formal legal review before proceeding." Lydia set her pen down. "She has no legal standing to raise that concern," she said. "She does not," Graves agreed. "However, she has engaged her own solicitor, who has written to me formally, which means the matter is now on paper, which means I am obligated to respond to it on paper, which means a process has begun that will require him to resolve regardless of its merits." "She's not trying to win a legal argument," Lydia said. "She's trying to delay publication long enough to make it not worth finishing." "Yes," Graves said. "That is my reading of it as well. What do you need from me?" He looked at her steadily. "Every authorization you have for this work. His Grace's written approval. My own letters confirming the scope and terms. Your employment agreement. The quarterly reports. The correspondence with His Grace about publication." He paused. "Everything. I have all of it," Lydia said. "I've kept every document related to this project since the first day. Dated, filed, in order." Graves looked at her for a moment. "Of course you have," he said, with something in his voice that was as close to warmth as she had heard from him. "How long will this take to resolve? If His Grace is willing to respond promptly and clearly." 2 weeks if he hesitates longer." Graves stood. "I'll speak with him this afternoon." "Mr. Graves," Lydia said. He paused. "Tell him what this is," she said. "Not the legal version. The actual version. Tell him that Beatrice Whitlock has calculated that if she creates enough procedural delay, the project loses momentum and Lydia Mercer loses patience and the whole thing quietly disappears. Tell him she has made that calculation correctly about how most people respond to obstruction." She looked at him steadily. "And tell him she has made it incorrectly about me." Graves looked at her. He picked up his hat. "I will convey that," he said, and left. Nathaniel's response to Beatrice's solicitor's letter was sent within 48 hours. Lydia did not read it before it was sent. She would not have asked to, but Graves showed her a copy afterward. It was 4 paragraphs long. It was written in the careful, precise language of a man who had thought about each sentence before he wrote it. It confirmed Lydia's authorization in full. It confirmed the scope of the project. It stated plainly that publication was intended and that the estate's position on the matter was unambiguous. The 4th paragraph was the one she read 3 times. The suggestion that Miss Mercer's use of the late Duchess's papers constitutes unauthorized access is without foundation in fact or law. These papers were made available to Miss Mercer with my full knowledge and written authorization, as documented in correspondence with my solicitor, Mr. Theodore Graves. Miss Mercer has conducted herself throughout this engagement with a professional rigor that I have rarely encountered in any capacity. Any further correspondence on this matter should be directed to Mr. Graves." She read it 3 times. Then she folded it and handed it back to Graves. "He wrote it himself," Graves said. "He did not ask me to draft it." "I know," she said. "You can tell from the 4th paragraph." Graves allowed himself a small smile. "Yes, you can." She went back to the appendices and worked for the rest of the afternoon without stopping. The first copy of the completed manuscript arrived from the printer in late July. Lydia was alone in the library when the package came. The messenger brought it in and set it on the work table and left. And she sat with it for a full minute before she opened it. The binding was plain. She had specified plain. because the content was not plain and the two things did not need to compete. The title page read exactly as she had written it. Records of Blackthorn Estate begun by Evelyn Ashcombe. Completed and edited by Lydia Mercer. Below that, the date range of the records. Below that, the archive location. Nathaniel's name appeared only on the inside-facing page. In a brief note acknowledging his ownership of the source materials and his authorization of the project. Not as author, not as patron in the way that word usually functioned. As owner of the archive. The distinction was precise and intentional, and she had written it 3 different ways before she found the version that said exactly what she meant. She opened to the first page of the main text and read the first paragraph she had written, the one that had taken her 4 days to get right. The introduction that situated the project and its purpose without either overstating its importance or understating it. It was good. She closed the book, she sat with it on the table in front of her, and she did not cry. Because she was not a woman who cried easily, and also because she had not yet finished. The publication was not the end. It was the condition she had set for herself. The thing that needed to exist in the world under her name before anything else could be decided. And it existed, and now she had to decide. She heard the door. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. He had clearly been told the package had arrived. He looked at the book on the table. He looked at her face. He came in and sat down across from her without speaking. He waited. "It's right," she said, finally, the way it came out. "It's what it should be." "I know," he said. "I read the final draft 3 times. She looked at him. "You never told me that. I didn't want to say something before it was finished that would make it harder for you to finish it." He looked at the book. "I was afraid if I told you how it read, what I thought of it, you would feel completed before it was actually complete. And you needed to be the one to finish it." She thought about that. It was, she realized, the most precise and most careful thing he had said to her in 2 years of careful conversation. "Nathaniel," she said, "yes, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without responding until I've finished." He nodded. "When you offered me this work 2 years ago, I accepted it because the work was real and needed doing, and I was the person best suited to do it. That was the whole of my calculation." She looked at the book. "Over the past 2 years, that calculation has changed. Not about the work was always real. But about why I was willing to stay in a situation that was sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes genuinely difficult, and occasionally required me to defend myself against people who should not have needed to be argued with." She paused. "The reason I stayed is only partly about the work." Nathaniel was very still. "I am telling you this now," she said, "and not 6 months ago or 6 months from now. Because 6 months ago, the book was not finished, and it needed to be finished before I was willing to say anything that could change what it was." She finally looked at him directly. "The book is finished, it exists, it has my name on it. Whatever happens next cannot change that," he said. "Lydia, I'm not finished," she said. He closed his mouth. "I am not going to make this easy for you," she said. "I want you to understand that before you say anything. Whatever you are about to say, whatever you think you want, I need you to understand that I have conditions. And the conditions are not negotiable, and they are not going to feel like the conditions a woman in a story is supposed to have at this moment." She could see him trying not to smile. "All right," he said. She looked at him steadily. He said, quietly, "Will you marry me?" The fire crackled. The book sat on the table between them. "No," she said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripple of it cross his face, not just surprise, but a deeper shock, the shock of a man who had been certain enough to ask and had not prepared a response to that answer. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. He did not sound angry. He sounded genuinely confused, which was more honest. "I know what you thought," she said. "You thought I told you. The book needed to be finished first. And the book is finished, and therefore I was ready." She kept her voice even. "That is not what I said. I said the book needed to exist before anything else could be decided. It exists, now I'm deciding. No, I'm deciding not yet. She looked at him. If I marry you today, every page of that book becomes something the Duke gave his future wife to occupy her time. That is not what the historical record will show. I know what the documentation says, but it is what the story becomes. In the telling, in the memory of everyone who was in this county 2 years ago when this all began, she held his gaze. History is full of women who were known correctly in their own time and remembered incorrectly afterward. Then what do you need? He said. He was not arguing. He was asking, with the directness of a man who had learned over 2 years that asking Lydia Mercer a direct question was the only effective approach. I need the book to be in the world for 6 months, she said. I need the letters from scholars to arrive addressed to me. I need the record to establish itself as a thing that exists independently, that was reviewed and consulted and referenced before our marriage could be attributed as its cause. She paused. After that, I will give you a different answer. Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. 6 months, he said. That is, he said carefully. A remarkably strategic response to a marriage proposal, she said. I am a remarkably strategic person. You have had 2 years to notice that. Something shifted in his face. The shock had moved through, and what was underneath it was something quieter and more durable recognition. She thought. The recognition of a man who has just been reminded, in the most personal possible context, of exactly who he is dealing with. 6 months, he said again. Yes. He looked at the book. He picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The thing that 2 dead people and 1 living woman had made out of notebooks and ledgers and 40 years of tenant history that would otherwise have been lost. He set it back down. All right, he said. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He was almost at the door when he stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, he said, I would have given you the same answer. The same conditions, if our positions were reversed. She looked at him. I know, she said. He left. She sat alone with the book in front of her, and the fire behind her, and the 2 years of work on the shelves around her. And she breathed in once, all the way down, and let it out slowly. Then she opened the book to page 41 of the completed text and read the entry about Agnes Harrow. She had written it herself, building from Evelyn's notes and the letters Evelyn had copied, and 3 additional records she had found in the East Wing storage that Evelyn had not known about. The finished entry was 4 pages long. It gave Agnes Harrow a full history where she had come from, how long her family had worked the South Parcel, what the 1,809 harvest failure had actually meant in specific and measurable terms for a widow with 4 children and a lease she could not meet. And at the end, the thing she had added herself, not from Evelyn's notes but from her own 3 months of searchings, was what happened to Agnes Harrow after February 1810. She had found the parish records in the county archive in October. After Graves had quietly arranged her access, Agnes Harrow had moved 12 miles east to her sister's household. She had worked as a seamstress for 6 years. Her eldest son had become a schoolteacher. Her youngest daughter had married a miller and had 3 children of her own. She had not disappeared from the record. She had simply been in a part of the record nobody had looked at. Lydia closed the book. Outside the library, somewhere in the house, a door opened and footsteps crossed the entrance hall and faded. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon. Blackthorn Hall going about its business the way it had gone about its business for 100 years. With or without anyone paying attention. She thought about Beatrice Whitlock, who would read the published record, eventually had probably already been told it existed, had probably already made a plan for how to receive it publicly. She thought about Julian, who had read the sections about 1,809 in silence and returned them in the order he'd received them. She thought about Graves, who had stopped arriving with his mind already made up. She thought about Margaret, who had carried a wooden box up 2 flights of stairs on a Tuesday night and set it on a dressing table and waited. She thought about Nathaniel saying, "For what it's worth, I would have given you the same answer," she thought. 6 months is not very long, she thought. Yes, it is. Both things were true. She had always been comfortable with two true things existing at the same time. It was one of the things her father had taught her. Sitting in a cold schoolroom in Massachusetts with a Latin text open across his lap and $17 in a tin box, and the absolute unshakable conviction that a mind was worth developing regardless of whose head it happened to occupy. She put her hand flat on the cover of the book. Her name was on it. Whatever happened next, her name was on it. That was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. She opened the book to the next section she needed to review and began to read. The first letter arrived on a Thursday morning in September. 3 weeks after publication. Lydia was at the work table in the library when Margaret brought it in, not the library's work table, which she still used out of habit, but which technically belonged to the estate's general operations, now that the project was complete. She had been sitting there reading a volume on county land reform that Nathaniel had left without comment 2 days earlier. The way he still left things: books, documents, a cup of coffee, without requiring acknowledgement. Margaret set the envelope on the table. The address read, Miss Lydia Mercer, Blackthorn Estate Archive. Blackthorn Hall. Not Miss Mercer. Not Miss Mercer. Household staff. Not even Miss Mercer, project assistant. Editor. She looked at the envelope for a moment without picking it up. Margaret said, "Well, open it." She opened it. The letter was from a professor of agricultural history at Edinburgh University. He had received a copy of the records through a colleague and had spent 4 days reading it. He wrote that the cross-reference methodology she had employed was the most rigorous he had encountered in a privately commissioned historical record. He had 3 specific questions about the 1,798 tenant documentation and whether additional source materials were available for consultation. He asked when the archive would be accessible to outside researchers. Lydia read the letter twice. Then she set it down very carefully. The way you set something down when you are afraid that if you are not careful, you will do something undignified with it. Good? Margaret said. Yes, Lydia said. Her voice came out slightly different from usual. She cleared her throat. Yes, it's good. Margaret looked at her with the expression she reserved for situations where she had something to say and had decided to say it indirectly. I'll tell Cook you'll want breakfast this morning after all, she said. And left. Lydia sat alone with the letter, she thought. 6 months. She thought 3 weeks down. She thought, this is going to be a very long autumn. The second letter arrived 5 days later. The third came the following week. By the end of September there were 7. From 4 different counties, and one from a reformer in London, who had been compiling evidence for a parliamentary committee on tenant conditions, and had found the records documentation of the 1809 crisis in the eastern parcels more useful than anything he had encountered in 3 years of research. He asked if Miss Mercer would be willing to submit a written summary of her methodology for inclusion in the committee's published materials. Lydia read that one standing up, which was not her habit. She read it standing up, and then she sat down and read it again. She wrote back to all 7 letters within the week. She answered the Edinburgh professor's 3 questions in detail and confirmed that the archive was available for consultation by appointment. She provided the London Reformer with a 4-page summary of her methodology and the specific evidentiary basis for the 1809 documentation. She told none of this to Nathaniel. She was not sure why. At first. Then she understood. She needed to be certain the work stood on its own ground before she showed him the evidence that it did. She needed to know it for herself before she knew it with him present. The distinction was important, and she trusted herself to know why it was important, even when she could not fully articulate it. He found out anyway. He always did. Graves had been copied on several of the letters as part of the formal archive documentation process, and Graves mentioned it to Nathaniel on a Wednesday morning, with the precise brevity of a man who has calculated exactly how much to say. Nathaniel appeared in the library doorway that afternoon. Edinburgh, he said. And London, she said. She did not look up from what she was writing. and a historian from Bristol who believes the cross-reference methodology could be applied to 3 other county archives he is working with. Nathaniel was quiet. "You're not going to say anything," she said. "I'm trying to determine," he said. "Which of the many things I want to say would be most welcome. Try the honest one." "I am not surprised," he said. "I have known for 2 years that this was what it would be." The surprise would have been anything less. He came in and sat down. "Are you going to tell me you're surprised?" "No," she said. "I knew what it was, too. But knowing and having the letters arrive are different experiences." "Yes," he said. "I imagine they are." She put her pen down. She looked at him. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention he had developed over 2 years, the focused, patient attention of a man who had learned that looking at Lydia Mercer carefully was more informative than asking her questions. 3 months, she said. He understood immediately. "You said 6-7 letters in 3 weeks, she said. "From researchers and reformers who found the work useful without being told to find it useful. Without my name attached to your household's reputation. Without any social context except the work itself." She held his gaze. "The 6 months was about establishing independence from the circumstances of our association." "I believe that has been established," Nathaniel said. "Very carefully, is this you changing the conditions? This is me telling you that the evidence supports revising the timeline. The conditions were always about what the evidence showed. The evidence has arrived faster than I expected." She paused. "I remain extremely strategic." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. The word came out simply and completely and without qualification. The way true answers do when a person has been building toward them for long enough that when they finally arrive there is nothing attached to them but the fact itself. Nathaniel let out a long, slow breath. She had not known until that moment that he had been holding it. "Right," he said. "All right," she said. They looked at each other across the work table covered in correspondence and archive documentation, and the 4-page methodology summary she had been finishing when he walked in. Then she picked her pen back up. "I need to finish this letter," she said. "The London committee needs the methodology summary by Friday." He almost laughed. She could see at the sound that didn't quite make it out. He stood up. "Of course," he said. "Nathaniel," he turned. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said, "properly, not in the library. Somewhere that isn't covered in paper." This time the sound did make it out. Small, genuine, the laugh of a man who has just realized that yes was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a conversation that was going to last the rest of his life. Conducted by a woman who would correct him, redirect him, and outthink him consistently, and that this was exactly what he wanted. "Tomorrow," he said, and left. The formal announcement came in October, and Beatrice Whitlock's response to it came in 3 stages. Which was how Lydia knew it was. Beatrice, lesser social strategist, responded in one move. The way an amateur chess player commits all their pieces at once. Beatrice always had 3 stages. The first stage was silence. 3 days of it, which in county society functioned as a statement. Beatrice not commenting was Beatrice making clear she was deciding what to say rather than reacting. The second stage was selective congratulation. She sent a note to Nathaniel, not to both of them. To Nathaniel specifically, addressed to him alone, expressing warm wishes for his happiness and hope that he had considered the matter fully. The note managed to omit Lydia's name entirely while being technically about her marriage, which was a feat of social engineering that Lydia actually appreciated on a technical level. The third stage arrived at a county gathering in late October that Lydia attended for the first time, not as staff, not as working professional, but as the woman who was engaged to the Duke of Ashcombe. She had known the third stage was coming. She had prepared for it the same way she prepared for anything, by thinking about it clearly in advance, without either minimizing it or catastrophizing it, and deciding what she was willing to do and what she was not. She was not willing to avoid Beatrice. Avoidance was the social equivalent of leaving before Thursday morning it handed the narrative to someone else. She was not willing to be warm toward her. False warmth required maintaining a performance. And performances had an overhead cost she was not willing to pay. What she was willing to be was honest. Precisely, carefully. Publicly honest, in the way she had been honest at that first dinner 3 years ago. Beatrice found her near the end of the gathering, in the way people with something to accomplish find their way to the person they need to accomplish it with, not directly. Not immediately, but through the gradual social maneuvering of a woman who understood that arriving at a conversation too early made the intent obvious. "Miss Mercer," Beatrice said. Then, with the particular precision of a woman using a correction as a weapon. "I beg your pardon. How quickly things change. I shall have to accustom myself. You may continue calling me Miss Mercer," Lydia said. "Until January I still am." Beatrice smiled. "And after January?" "After January I expect you'll manage whatever you decide to manage," Lydia said pleasantly. "You've always been resourceful with language." The two women near Beatrice went slightly still. "I hear the records has been well received in certain circles," Beatrice said. "In several circles," Lydia said. 7 letters in the first 3 weeks. A request from a parliamentary committee. An inquiry from Edinburgh about consulting the archive. She said it without emphasis, as though reciting a list, which was more effective than any tone she could have chosen. "I was pleased by the response." "I'm sure you were," Beatrice said. The pleasantness in her voice had gone slightly thinner. "Though one must wonder in time how the work will be remembered. Whether it will be the Ashcombe Archive or something else, it will be remembered as the Blackthorn Estate Records," Lydia said. "Begun by Evelyn Ashcombe, completed and edited by Lydia Mercer." That is what the title page says. That is what Edinburgh's correspondence references. That is what the parliamentary committee cited. She looked at Beatrice directly. "I find that precise and accurate attribution tends to persist, Mrs. Whitlock, regardless of how the story is later told." Beatrice looked at her. The pleasantness had gone entirely now, replaced by something that was almost respect, the grudging recognition of a strategist who has encountered a better one. "You are nothing like I expected," Beatrice said quietly. "Not as a statement of fact." "No," Lydia said. "I don't imagine I am." She excused herself and moved away. And she did not look back, because not looking back was its own form of punctuation. Nathaniel had watched the exchange from across the room. He came to her side afterward and said nothing for a moment. "I was going to intervene," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm glad you didn't. She won't stop entirely." "No," Lydia said. "But she'll stop expecting to win. That's sufficient." She looked at him. "You were 12 feet away the whole time, 10, he said. "I moved closer when she started the conversation." "Did you think I needed you closer?" He thought about it. "No," he said honestly. "I moved closer because I wanted to be." She looked at him. The gathering moved around them, conversations, social maneuvering. The elaborate performance of a county society that had been performing itself for generations. All of it proceeding as it always had, with or without her in the room. "That's a better answer," she said. He offered her his arm, which was the first time he had done so in a public social setting. And the significance of it was not lost on anyone in the room, including Lydia, who took it without comment and without ceremony, and simply kept walking. Julian arrived at Blackthorn the following weekend with a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for an occasion he described as suitably complicated, and a handshake for Nathaniel that lasted slightly longer than handshakes usually did between men who have known each other all their lives and have recently navigated something difficult. He brought Lydia a book. She looked at it. It was a volume on county agricultural history. Published 12 years earlier, dense and dry, and exactly the kind of text she would have sought out herself. "It's referenced in 3 of Evelyn's notebooks," Julian said. "I thought you'd want it for the archive." "I've been trying to locate a copy for 8 months, she said. "I know. Graves mentioned it." He paused. "There's an inscription." She opened the front cover. The inscription read in a hand she did not recognize, "For Julian, who will understand this better than most." Evelyn's handwriting. She would have known it in the dark by now. She looked up at Julian. His jaw was tight. "She gave it to me 8 years ago," he said. "I didn't understand what she was working on at the time. I thought it was a passing interest." He looked at the book. "I should have paid more attention." "Yes," Lydia said. "But you're paying attention now." He looked at her. Something moved in his face, not quite emotion, but the suppression of it, which was close enough. "She would have liked you," he said. "Evelyn. She would have argued with you constantly and liked you enormously." "I would have liked her," Lydia said. "I already do, in a manner of speaking." Julian nodded once. He turned to Nathaniel and said, "She's going to be exhausting," in the tone of a man delivering a compliment. "I am aware," Nathaniel said. "Good," Julian said, and opened the whiskey. The wedding was in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, in the small chapel on the Blackthorn estate. Margaret attended in the third pew on the left and did not cry, which was entirely in character, though her expression for approximately 4 minutes during the ceremony was the closest she had come to crying in 20 years, and she was aware of it and managed it by looking at the floor. Theodore Graves attended. Julian attended and stood as Nathaniel's witness, which was a decision that had taken him approximately 30 seconds to agree to when asked, and which he had not discussed further. There were 14 guests in total. The chapel held 60. The space was not full, and it did not need to be. Lydia wore a gown she had commissioned in September. Before the first letter arrived, before the 6 months became 3, before anything had been formally decided, she had commissioned it quietly, without telling anyone, which was how she made decisions she intended to keep. It was deep blue wool with ivory at the collar, not silk. Not formal in the way of social performance, but formal in the way of intention, of a woman dressing for something she had chosen, rather than something she was required to attend. She had not worn Evelyn's gown again after that Thursday night. She had not needed to. That gown had done exactly what it needed to do, and belonged now to its own chapter of the story, which was finished. Before the ceremony, in the small anteroom off the chapel where she waited with Margaret, Nathaniel sent her a package. She unwrapped it. It was a book. The volume she had secretly borrowed from the library in the weeks before the dinner, the first book she had pulled from the upper shelves. The one she had read before sunrise in the Duke's reading chair with a candle and a cup of cold tea. She had returned it carefully. She had not touched it since. This was not the same copy. This was a new binding. Restored careful, the leather supple in a way that indicated someone had paid attention to it for several months. Inside the front cover, in Nathaniel's handwriting. Careful and slightly formal, the way his handwriting always was when he was writing something he intended to mean. For Lydia Mercer, who never needed permission to know what she knew. She read it. She read it twice. She thought about saying something sentimental about it to Margaret, who was standing 4 feet away watching her face with the expression of a woman who has been waiting 3 years for this particular moment. She removed the inscription page. She heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. "That," Lydia said, "is much too sentimental." She folded the page and set it on the small table beside her. "He may write another." Margaret looked at her. Then she said, "You are going to make that man work very hard." "Yes," Lydia said. "He is aware. He seems to consider it a fair arrangement." "He does." She closed the book and held it. "That is one of the things I like best about him." Margaret straightened the collar of Lydia's gown with 2 precise adjustments, the way she had been straightening things for 30 years, and said nothing further, because she was a woman who understood that some moments were complete without addition. Afterward, at the small gathering in the house, no grand dinner. No 23 county guests, just 14 people, and a table that was the right size for 14 people. Julian raised his glass and said, "To Evelyn, who started something," and then looked at Lydia and said, "And to the woman stubborn enough to finish it." Lydia raised her glass. Nathaniel said quietly, only to, "You know he's been working on that for 2 weeks. It shows." "It's very good." Later that evening, when the guests had gone, and the house had returned to its quieter self, Nathaniel found her in the library. She had gone there out of habit, the same way she went there every evening. The same way she had been going there for 3 years. She was not working. She was simply sitting at the work table with the Edinburgh professor's most recent letter in front of her. A response she owed him about the methodology questions he had raised in his third correspondence. Nathaniel sat across from her. He looked at the letter. He looked at the shelves. He looked at the 2 rows of completed records. Evelyn's dark green notebooks and Lydia's plain brown ones standing side by side in the same section, which had been Lydia's arrangement, and which she had not asked anyone's opinion about. He said, "Are you happy?" She considered the question the way she considered all questions, seriously, without reflexive answers. "I am building something," she said. "I am in a house that will allow me to build it. I am married to a man who will not attempt to finish my sentences or decide in advance what I am capable of. The archive has received 14 letters in 2 months from people who found the work useful." She looked at him. "I am satisfied. I expect happiness follows from satisfaction rather than preceding it. That is the least romantic definition of happiness I have ever heard," Nathaniel said. "Yes," she said. "But is it inaccurate?" He thought about it. "No," he said, "then it will do." She went back to the letter she owed Edinburgh. He stayed, which was his habit, not intruding, not requiring conversation. Simply being present in the room the way the room itself was present. Steady and warm and reliable, she wrote for 40 minutes. He read. Outside the library, Blackthorn Hall settled into its nighttime quiet, the sounds of a house that knew itself, that had held its history for 100 years and had just agreed, in some fundamental way, to hold it differently going forward. When she put her pen down, she said without looking up, "I removed your inscription." "I know," he said. "Mark told me. Are you going to write another?" "I have been composing alternatives for approximately 6 hours," he said. "None of them are satisfactory. Try the honest one." He was quiet for a moment. "You came into this house," he said, "wearing grief that wasn't yours, to a table that had no right to seat you, and you made every person in that room understand something they had not understood before without raising your voice or losing your composure." He looked at her. "And then you stayed and built something that will last longer than any of us. That is what I want the inscription to say. I haven't found the words for it yet." She looked at him. "You have until tomorrow," she said. "You'll hold me to that." "I hold everyone to their stated timelines," she said. "You have had 2 years to learn that," he smiled. It was the smile of a man who has arrived, after considerable difficulty, and not a small amount of earned correction, at a life that fits him correctly, not because it is easy but because it is true. And truth, he had finally learned, was worth considerably more than comfort. "Get some sleep," Lydia said. "I have correspondence to finish in the morning and I will need the library quiet. It's our wedding night," he said. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "And the Edinburgh letter is due Friday." She looked up at him. "I can do both, Nathaniel. I have always been able to do both." He stood. He straightened his jacket. He was almost at the door when he turned back the way he always did. It was his habit. She had learned to save the most honest thing for the doorway, as though the act of leaving gave him permission to say it. "The inscription," he said. "The one you tore out." She waited. "I meant every word of it," he said. "You never did need permission." She looked at him across the library. Across 2 years of work table and coffee cups and 14 notebooks and 60 pages of index and the particular accumulated weight of a life built inside a single consistent choice to keep working. To keep being exactly who she was, regardless of who found it convenient. "I know," she said. "That is why I kept the page." He looked at her. "It's in my desk," she said. "Third drawer. Behind the Edinburgh correspondence." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he said good night, and the sound of his steps moved away down the corridor. And the library settled into its quiet again. and Lydia Mercer, who was Lydia Ashcombe now on all the formal documents, but who had been Lydia Mercer on the title page of the records and intended to remain so in every professional capacity going forward, and had already discussed this with Graves and Nathaniel both, and received no argument from either, picked up her pen and went back to the Edinburgh letter. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she set the pen down and sat for a moment in the warm, dark quiet. She thought about her father's tin box with $17 in it. She thought about the letter of reference nobody had bothered to verify. She thought about 3 years of early mornings and the reading chair and the green leather notebook behind the third panel and a wooden box on a dressing table and a chair crashing backward and the particular sound of a room full of people going silent. She thought about Agnes Harrow's youngest daughter, who had married a miller and had 3 children, and whose name was now in the record where it belonged. She put her hand flat on the cover of the Edinburgh professor's letter. Outside, somewhere in Blackthorn Hall, a door opened and closed. Ordinary sounds, a house going about its life. She blew out the candle and went to bed. The scholarship was Lydia's idea, and like most of her ideas, it arrived not as inspiration but as consequence, the natural conclusion of a chain of reasoning she had been following for long enough that by the time she reached the end of it, it felt obvious rather than bold. It was March, 14 months after the wedding, and she was in the library reviewing the 3rd quarterly report from the Edinburgh professor, who had now visited the archive twice and was citing the records in a monograph he expected to publish the following year. She had also received that week a letter from a woman in Bristol named Clara Holt, who was attempting to compile a similar record of her own county's tenant histories and had written to ask for guidance on methodology. Lydia had written back immediately and in detail. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, answering every question Clara Holt had asked, and several she had not yet thought to ask. She sent the letter that afternoon. The following morning she sat at the work table and thought. Clara Holt knew enough to ask the questions. The woman in the flooded cottage in Evelyn's notebook, Agnes Harrow's neighbor, unnamed, who had written one letter that went unanswered and then disappeared from the record entirely, she had not known enough to ask. She had not known that asking was a thing she was permitted to do. The difference between those 2 women was not intelligence. It was access. It was the specific, material, transmissible thing called education, which Lydia's father had given her in a cold schoolroom in Massachusetts, and which had made every other thing in her life possible. She went to find Nathaniel. He was in the estate office, which was still where he went when he was thinking, rather than simply existing. He looked up when she came in and waited. "I want to establish a scholarship," she said, "for daughters of estate workers. Annual. Covering educational costs for 1 student per selected on the basis of demonstrated ability, not family circumstance," Nathaniel said. "All right," she stopped. "I expected more resistance." "I know you did," he said. "I've been waiting for you to ask for 6 months. I was beginning to think I'd have to suggest it myself," which would have produced a lengthy conversation about whose idea it was. She looked at him. "You knew I was going to ask. I watched you write a 2-hour letter to a woman in Bristol about research methodology," he said. "For free. Out of what I can only describe as compulsive generosity toward anyone who is trying to do serious work without sufficient resources." He picked up his pen. "Yes, I knew you were going to ask. I'm not compulsively generous," she said. "I'm strategic. The more people who know how to do this work, the more comprehensive the historical record becomes, which serves the project's purpose." "Of course," he said, in the tone of a man who has learned when not to argue. "Talk to Graves about the structure. He'll need the annual budget figure and the selection criteria." She turned to go. "Lydia." She turned back. "Name it after your father," he said. "Not after me. Not after the estate. After the man who taught you Latin in a cold room in Massachusetts." She looked at him for a long moment. "The Mercer Educational Fund." "Yes," he said. She went to find Graves. The library's public access hours were established the following month, And this was the change that Blackthorn Hall's staff felt most directly and most personally, because it altered the fundamental nature of a room they had been walking past for years. 2 evenings per week, between 7 and 9, the library was open. Not to county guests, not to the gentry, to anyone in the household or on the estate who wished to use it. The first week, nobody came. Lydia had expected this. She said nothing about it to anyone. The second week, 2 of the stable hands came in on a Tuesday evening, looked at the shelves with expressions of people who have arrived, somewhere they are uncertain they are permitted to be, and left after 20 minutes without taking anything down. She had been at the work table. She did not look up when they entered and did not look up when they left. She simply kept working, which was her way of demonstrating that their presence required no performance from anyone. The third week, the younger of the 2 stable hands came back alone and stayed for an hour and read 3 chapters of a natural history volume he had pulled carefully from the second shelf. He replaced it in exactly the position he had found it. He left without speaking. The 4th week he came back and brought his younger sister. By the 6th week, there were 7 regular users of the Tuesday evening hours. Margaret reported this to Lydia with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been watching something planted slowly take root. 8, counting yourself, Margaret said. I'm not a user, Lydia said. I work here. You work here in the evening, specifically on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Margaret said, which happens to coincide with the access hours, which you set. The work doesn't stop because it's Tuesday, Lydia said. No, Margaret said. It doesn't. They looked at each other with the particular economy of 2 women who have said everything they need to say without saying most of it. The first Mercer scholar was selected in September of that year. Her name was Ruth Haynes. She was 16, the daughter of the estate's head carpenter. And she had been recommended by the village schoolmaster in a letter that ran to 4 pages and which the schoolmaster had clearly revised multiple times. The evidence being the slightly different ink densities in adjacent paragraphs. He wrote that Ruth Haynes had read everything available to her in the village school by the age of 12 and had since been borrowing books from anyone willing to lend them. He wrote that her mathematical reasoning was the most precise he had encountered in 20 years of teaching. He wrote that he had never made a formal recommendation of this kind before and wanted to be clear that he was not doing so lightly. Lydia read the letter twice. She interviewed Ruth Haynes in the library on a Wednesday morning. Ruth was 16 and gave the impression of a person who had learned to take up very little physical space in rooms where other people had more claim to it than she did. She sat in the straight-back chair across from Lydia's work table, with her hands folded in her lap, and answered every question with the precise minimal completeness of a girl who had learned that saying. Too much was a social risk she could not yet afford. Lydia recognized this immediately and specifically. She put her pen down. Miss Haynes, she said, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly rather than carefully. There's a difference. Ruth looked at her. Yes, ma'am. What do you actually want to study? Ruth's hands tightened in her lap. She said carefully, Mathematics has been suggested as a... I didn't ask what has been suggested, Lydia said. I asked what you want. Ruth was quiet for a moment. The clock on the mantel ticked 3 times. Architecture, Ruth said. Very quietly, like a confession, Lydia looked at her. Structural design, Ruth said. How buildings work. How weight distributes. I've been reading everything I can find on it, but there isn't much available in the village and I don't. I know it's not a conventional, Miss Haynes, Lydia said. The scholarship covers educational costs for the course of study you are best suited for and most committed to pursuing. Architecture and structural design require mathematical foundations that you apparently already possess. She picked her pen back up. I will write to 2 institutions this week about their programs. You will receive the list of options by the end of the month. Ruth stared at her. You may close your mouth, Lydia said, not unkindly. Ruth closed her mouth. Then she said, Does His Grace know about? His Grace established the fund, Lydia said. The selection criteria are mine. The decisions are mine. She looked at Ruth directly. Nobody in this room requires anyone else's approval for what we have just decided. Is that clear? Ruth Haynes looked at Lydia Mercer across the work table in the library of Blackthorn Hall. And something in her face shifted the careful, space-conserving, socially cautious expression that she had been wearing since she walked in, dissolving into something younger and more unguarded and more true. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "That's clear. Nathaniel found out about the architecture decision from Graves, who found out from the letter Lydia sent to Edinburgh requesting program information. He came to the library that evening while she was writing the second letter to an institution in London. Architecture, he said. She wants architecture, Lydia said without looking up. She has the aptitude for it. The scholarship covers it. Nobody will employ a woman as an architect. Not yet, Lydia said. She put a period at the end of her sentence with slightly more force than necessary. In 20 years, the conversation will be different. She will be 20 years ahead of it. She looked up. I did not ask you, Nathaniel, because I did not require your agreement. I am telling you as a courtesy. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He said, I know. I wasn't objecting. You said nobody will employ. I was thinking out loud, he said. I do that occasionally. You've been correcting it for 3 years. She looked at him. You're not objecting? I'm observing a fact about current conditions, he said. The fact doesn't determine what should be done. You've made that argument to me multiple times. I've been paying attention. She set her pen down. Good, she said. Can I sit down? You own the library. I don't think that's been true for several years in any practical sense, he said. And sat down and picked up the Edinburgh professor's most recent letter from the stack near his end of the table and began reading it. She watched him for a moment, the familiar sight of him reading at her work table. In her library, in the chair he had been sitting in since a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, when he had come down before 6 with homemade coffee and the most honest apology she had ever received. She went back to her letter. They worked in the same room for the next 2 hours without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that does not require words because it has been conducted for long enough that the silence has become fluent. The twist that Lydia had not anticipated arrived on a Thursday morning in November, in the form of a letter from Beatrice Whitlock, not a social letter. Not a congratulatory note of the kind. Beatrice had perfected the kind that managed to contain both warmth and condescension in the same sentence, without either quality being identifiable enough to object to. This letter was 3 paragraphs long, and it was, by Beatrice's standards, plain. She wrote that she had read the records, all of it. Twice. She wrote that she had given a copy to her late husband's estate solicitor and asked him to review the methodology applied to the tenant records, because her husband's estate contained similar documentation that had never been organized. She wrote that she wished to consult Lydia professionally about whether such a project was feasible for a private estate without a resident archivist. She did not apologize for the dinner 3 years ago. She did not acknowledge it. She did not reference Lydia's former position in the household. The letter was addressed to Lydia Mercer Ashcombe, which was the name on the title page of the records, and it treated the recipient as the professional that name indicated. Lydia read it 3 times. Then she sat with it for a full 10 minutes, which was longer than she usually sat with anything. She was thinking about what the letter was and what it wasn't. It was not friendship. It was not remorse. It was not the social surrender of a woman who had recognized she was wrong and wanted to say so. Beatrice Whitlock was not built for that kind of reckoning, and Lydia had never expected it from her. What it was this. Beatrice Whitlock had read the work. She had read it carefully enough to have an opinion about its methodology. She had found it useful enough to want to replicate it. And she had written to the woman who produced it, as the woman who produced it, not as the Duke's wife, not as the former maid, not as the social anomaly she had spent 3 years categorizing. As an expert. That was its own form of accounting. Not the one Lydia had wanted. but the one that was actually available from a woman like Beatrice, and she was clear-eyed enough to recognize it for what it was. She wrote back the same afternoon, 3 paragraphs. Professional. Specific. She confirmed that such a project was feasible and outlined 3 preliminary steps that would need to be taken before she could assess the scope of work. She named a consulting rate. She gave Graves's contact information for the formal arrangement. She did not mention the dinner. Neither had Beatrice. Some things were concluded not by being spoken but by being permanently superseded. And this was one of them. She told Nathaniel that evening. He read Beatrice's letter. He read Lydia's response. He set both down. You're going to consult for her, he said. Professionally. Yes. How do you feel about that? She thought about it. I feel that the work matters more than who commissions it. If Beatrice Whitlock's estate contains records of tenant families who deserve to be documented, then those families deserve the documentation regardless of who is paying for it. And Beatrice? Beatrice will receive professional service. She will not receive anything else. She looked at him. I am not required to forgive her. I am simply required to decide whether the work is worth doing. The work is worth doing. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Your father would have made the same calculation, he said. Yes, she said, he would have. And then he would have charged her appropriately for it. Nathaniel laughed the full one, not the controlled version, and Lydia allowed herself a small smile, which was as much as she usually committed to in these moments. Margaret retired in the spring. She did not announce it dramatically. She told Lydia on a Tuesday morning that she had decided the time had come, that her sister in Somerset had a spare room, and that she intended to leave at the end of the month. She said it the way she said most things, flatly. Finally, with no invitation to debate the conclusion. Lydia sat with it for a moment. You'll visit, she said. Regularly, Margaret said. I expect to have opinions about how things are being managed, and I intend to express them. Good, Lydia said. I rely on your opinions, I know you do. Margaret looked at the library, the shelves, the notebooks, the cross-reference index in its permanent place on the upper left, the second edition of the records that had been printed 6 months after the first, when demand exceeded the original run. She looked at all of it the way a person looks at something they built and have decided to trust to someone else. She would be pleased, Margaret said. Evelyn, I think about that sometimes, Lydia said. I know you do. Margaret straightened the nearest stack of correspondence, the habit of 40 years, the automatic ordering of things, and said, Don't let them put the archive in the East Wing. The East Wing is too cold in winter, and the documents will suffer. The archive stays in the library, Lydia said. I've already had that argument with the County Historical Society and won it. Good. Margaret picked up her tray. She had brought tea. As she always had, the continuity of small things that made large things possible. Then I think everything is as it should be. She left. Lydia sat alone for a moment. Then she opened the nearest letter from the stack that needed answering and began to read. The evening that Lydia would remember most clearly from those years, the one she returned to when she was trying to understand how far everything had traveled from a silver serving tray and a shaking hand. And a roomful of people laughing came in October. 3 years after the wedding. She was in the library at 7 in the evening. During Tuesday access hours, she was at the work table reading a draft report from the Bristol archive that Clara Holt had finally completed and sent for review, a meticulous piece of work. 4 years in the making, covering 90 years of tenant history in 2 adjoining counties. She heard something in the far corner of the library. A small sound, the particular sound of someone trying not to make a sound, which is always louder than ordinary silence. She looked up. A girl was standing in the corner near the lower shelves, half hidden by the end of the bookcase, with a volume pressed against her chest and an expression of absolute terror. She looked about 14. She was wearing the kitchen apron over her dress, which meant she had come directly from work, without changing. which meant she had come impulsively, which meant she had been wanting to come for some time, and had finally done it before she could think herself out of it. When Lydia's eyes found her, she went rigid, in the way of someone caught doing something they had been told, implicitly, was not for them. "Does Her Grace know you're here?" Margaret's voice would have said 3 years ago, from the doorway of this same library. But Margaret was in Somerset. Lydia said, "The shelves in that section are natural history and agricultural science. If you're looking for history, there's a better section on the north wall." The girl stared at her. "The second shelf from the top," Lydia said, "the red binding. That's the county record. Start there if you want something local." The girl did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then she said very quietly, I didn't take anything." "I can see that," Lydia said. "You're welcome to take something. That's what the access offers are for." "I'm just kitchen staff," the girl said. Lydia set her pen down. She looked at the girl across the library. "The access hours," she said, "are for anyone in the household or on the estate. That includes kitchen staff." She paused. "What's your name?" "Annie." "There are chairs along the east wall. If you're going to stand in the corner reading, you may as well sit down. It's better for the book." Annie looked at the chairs. She looked at the book in her arms. She looked at Lydia. She took 3 careful steps toward the nearest chair and sat on the very edge of it, as though taking up only a portion of the chair made her presence less of a trespass. Lydia watched her for a moment. She thought about a work table in this same room. Before sunrise, a candle and a cup of cold tea and a copy of Tacitus open across her lap, and the particular quality of concentration that comes from reading, something you have been wanting to read in a place where you are not supposed to be. She thought about what Margaret had said when she found the bag packed on a Tuesday night, giving them something they cannot categorize. She thought about Agnes Harrow's youngest daughter, who had 3 children of her own now, and whose name was in the record. She picked up her pen and went back to Clara Holt's draft. Annie sat in the chair and read. After 20 minutes, she shifted from the edge of the seat to the full of it. Lydia noticed. She said nothing. Nathaniel found her in the library at 9 o'clock, after the access hours had ended, and Annie had replaced the book carefully and left, and the room had returned to its evening quiet. He had a glass of wine he had brought for her without being asked, because he had been doing this for 3 years and had learned the precise moment in the evening when it was wanted. He set it on the table, he sat down, he looked at her face. "Something happened," he said. "A girl from the kitchen," she said. "She came in during access hours. She sat in the corner first, like she wasn't certain she was allowed in the chair. She picked up the wine glass. She moved to the full seat after 20 minutes. Nathaniel was quiet. "It's working," Lydia said. Not triumphantly, not with the declaration of someone who has won an argument. Just the plain acknowledgement of a person looking at evidence and reading it accurately. "Not all of it, not enough of it, but it's working." "Yes," he said. Ruth Haynes writes that her structural calculations professor told her last month that her load-bearing analysis was the strongest he had seen from a first-year student, she said. "She asked me if I thought she should tell him she had been studying independently since she was 12. What did you tell her?" "I told her yes. I told her that people who achieve things by working harder and longer than the conditions around them allowed should say so clearly. Because the alternative is to let the conditions take credit for outcomes they tried to prevent." Nathaniel looked at her. "Did she tell him?" "She wrote back last week," Lydia said. She told him. He asked if she'd be willing to tutor 2 other first-year students who were struggling with the same calculations. She picked up the wine. She said yes, she charged them appropriately. Nathaniel almost laughed. He contained it. "She learned that from you. She learned it from circumstance," Lydia said. "I simply confirmed it was the correct lesson." They sat in the room that had been hers before it was theirs, in the quiet that had become the language they used when words were working too hard to carry everything that needed to be carried. The fire had burned down to its comfortable late evening level. The shelves held their history. The notebooks stood in their order. Dark green and plain brown, Evelyn's and Lydia's side by side. After a while, Nathaniel said, "Do you remember what you told me once? That the gown changed my life, not yours." "Yes, you were right," he said. "I've thought about it many times since." He looked at the shelves. "But I think I've been wrong about what it changed." She waited. "I thought it changed how I saw you," he said. "That was what I meant when you said it, that seeing you in that doorway forced me to look at something I had been avoiding." He paused. "But that's not quite it. It changed how I saw myself. What I was willing to be. What I was unwilling to continue accepting about my own behavior." He looked at her. "You did that. Not the dress. She sat with that for a moment. "Nathaniel," she said, "I need to tell you something honestly." "Tell me." "I knew exactly what I was doing when I walked through that door." He looked at her. "Not all of it," she said. "I didn't know about the notebooks. I didn't know what the work would become. I didn't know about Edinburgh or Ruth Haynes or Annie from the kitchen sitting in the corner of the library." She met his gaze steadily. "But I knew that walking through that door, wearing that dress, in front of those people I knew, it was the kind of moment that doesn't come twice. And I knew that what I did with it would be the thing I was measured by for everything that came after." She paused. "I was not passive. I made a decision, I know," he said. "You always knew that." "Yes," he said. "It was one of the first things I knew about you." She looked at him, this man who had started as a coward in a dining room and become, through the patient accumulated work of being honestly corrected and honestly responded to. Someone she trusted with the whole of her life, not because he was perfect. Because he had looked at his own failures without looking away from them. "We have done all right," she said. "We have done considerably better than all right," he said. "Yes," she said. "But I don't like to overclaim," he smiled. The real one. The one that had taken her 6 months to see the first time, and which she could now read in its earliest stages. From the first slight change around his eyes, before it fully arrived. "Go to bed," she said. "I have 3 more pages of Clara Holt's draft to review. It's 9:30. The draft is due back to her by Friday." He stood. He gathered his jacket. He was at the door when he stopped and turned back, the doorway habit. "The honest thing saved for last. The inscription," he said. "The second one. The one I wrote after you tore out the first." She had it. She knew where it was, 3rd drawer, behind the Edinburgh correspondence, where she had moved the first one when the second arrived. She had never told him she kept both. "What about it?" she said. "Did you keep it?" She looked at him across the library. "Go to bed, Nathaniel," she said. He went. She sat alone in the library for a few minutes longer. With Clara Holt's draft in front of her, and the fire behind her, and the notebooks on the shelves, and the whole long road from a shaking hand beneath a silver tray to this room. This life, this work that was nowhere near finished. She thought about what she had told him years ago. That the gown had changed his life, not hers. That she had already known who she was. She had been right. She had known who she was. But knowing and becoming are not the same thing. You can know your own worth in the abstract and still spend years finding the specific shape that worth takes in the world, the particular form your life needs to take, to be true to what you actually are. The library had given her that shape. The notebooks. The index. The letters from Edinburgh and Bristol. Ruth Haynes and her structural calculations. Annie sitting on the edge of a chair and then the full of it. The Mercer Educational Fund. Clara Holt's 4-year draft sitting on the work table asking for 3 more pages of honest review. All of it. Every particular piece of it. She opened the draft to the page she had marked. She read for 20 minutes, making small notations in the margin, suggestions. Not corrections. Questions that Clara Holt would need to answer for herself. The same questions Evelyn had been asking in 14 dark green notebooks before anyone else had thought to ask them. When she reached the final page, she set the draft down. She sat for a moment with the stillness that comes not from emptiness but from fullness, from a life that has found its right shape and settled into it the way a well-made thing settles. Without noise, without drama, with the simple authority of something that has arrived where it belongs. Then she picked up her pen. She began to write. Outside the library, Blackthorn Hall went on with its life. Footsteps in the corridor. A door closing softly upstairs. The sounds of a house that had learned, over 3 years, to include more people in its definition of itself, more chairs occupied, more books borrowed, more names written down in records that would persist long after the people who made them had become history themselves. The library doors stayed open. They had been open for 3 years, and they would stay open after Lydia was gone. Because she had made sure of it in writing, legally documented. Witnessed by Graves and signed by Nathaniel, a permanent condition of the archive that no future owner of Blackthorn could revoke. She had not done it to be remembered. She had done it because Agnes Harrow's neighbor deserved a chair at the table. And because Ruth Haynes deserved to know the weight of a building's bones. And because Annie from the kitchen deserved to sit in the full of the seat. And because a mind was worth developing regardless of whose head it happened to occupy, and that truth did not require anyone's permission or approval or recognition to be true, it had simply been true all along. Waiting for someone with enough stubbornness and enough patience and enough of her father's plain belief in the value of an honest accounting to write it down where it could not be erased. Lydia Mercer had walked into that dining room 3 years ago because wealthy people wanted to discover whether a maid could behave like a lady. They found out something different entirely. They found out that dignity does not begin when powerful people decide to recognize it. It was always there. It had simply been waiting for the right woman to stop apologizing for it and to make sure, before she was done, that every door behind her stayed open for the ones who came next.